main person of the podcast for a while. So,
well, it's mostly I think
Want to
we
message me on
might-
Facebook?
Yeah, I can send it to you.
Sorry, guys.
Oh, good. We're getting reacquainted. Hi, welcome to Open Faith Discussion on Talk of Christ, Faith, Family, and Adventure. And let's see, I think we're live, and so we're like I say, getting reacquainted. It's been several months since we've done this, and we are just excited to maybe do this a little more often. Marty was just talking about her desire to get to know a little more about Blake Ostler, the father of our two Ostler guests. And Corey, will you start us out today with kind of a summary of this talk by Brother Corbitt that has kind of been making the rounds? He gave it at BYU, if I remember correctly, about activism towards the church. And we just wanted to comment and discuss on that today.
All right, yeah. So basically, and I've watched the talk a couple times, so I'm not like super expert on it, but I've been trying to follow a lot of like conversations about what like people's take on that have been, either in the faithful community or the ex-Mormon community, or progressive Mormon type things, and just to see where it's gone. But basically, to sum it up, as the title indicates, he takes on kind of a timely issue, which is activism towards and or against how
that week for the rest of you guys.
Yeah, Corey, you're cutting in and out right now.
Okay.
Do you know do you have a link to that? Do you have a link to the bulleted list?
Yeah, I have it pulled up if you want me to start going through so I get it figured out.
That if someone...
Go ahead, Jake.
Okay. Yeah, so like you were saying, it goes over the this tactic of activism against the church, and it's saying that it's a satanic tactic, or at least that's what the Millennial Star is the website that's provided this this brief overview. But there's a couple of quotes here, and then there's a bullet pointed list. So his first quote is, he says, "In my humble view, it is one of the great mists of darkness of our time. I speak of our enemy's effort to transform disciples of Jesus Christ into activists toward or against the Lord's church and its leaders. That the United States was founded on and through activism and advocacy by activists, and you and I are both beneficiaries of this activism. But activism or advocacy directed toward or against the church is a secular, worldly device misapplied in a spiritual, otherworldly context. And change in the kingdom of God is not accomplished the same way as it is in, say, government." And then he continued to say, "When activism or advocacy is directed at the kingdom of God on earth or its leaders, especially prophets and apostles, it is the wrong tool for the wrong job in the wrong place. Why? Because it effectively but subtly undermines the doctrine of Christ, which is God's plan for changing and saving and exalting his children." And then he provides an acronym of ATC. And let's see here. So ATC stands for activism towards the church. And here's the bullet point list where he comes up of some ways to, well, let's see. This actually has the Church News came up with its own list, but here are the quotes from the talk. He says, activism towards the church, or ATC, it is distrust, and distrust is the very opposite of the faith the Lord requires of his covenant people and himself, his prophets and apostles, and those they direct. It tends to focus on leaders' imperfections and opposes their testimonies by undermining their credibility in the eyes of followers. It's masquerading as a higher and nobler cause. ATC instigates distrust of these leaders, and by seemingly customizing this deceptive approach to the Valiant, he, being the adversary, cleverly diminishes their real power, which comes from faith, and robs them of their true mission, which is the gathering of the elect. He effectively turns the gatherers into scatterers. And then he said that ATC focuses on leaders' human weakness rather than their strengths and mantles. And in doing so, it subtly gives permission and justification for murmuring, backbiting, and evil speaking of the Lord's anointed, all deceptively cloaked as principled.
Okay, thank you. Marty, do you want to chime in on some of your initial thoughts or things you want to add to that summary or things you think are important to bring out at first?
Yeah, when I first listened to it, I thought it was really interesting how activism is good, except for when it's directed at our organization. That was interesting. It definitely, seems to me that it advocated for not questioning leaders, which is strange. Well, not strange. It's understandable within, like, if you have a mindset that the God speaks or the prophets speak for God, but it seems not that way when you don't believe that. It just feels like special pleading, I guess. Is that the right phrase? And then later on, I mean, I think he brings up some really great points on how activism doesn't actually isn't always good. Like I feel like that spirit of why he was, that just the contention and stuff like that is maybe less helpful. So like whereas if you're focusing, if I was trying to steel man like what the purpose of the church is trying to help everybody become better, it's hard to do that when you're just nitpicking a lot, I guess maybe is a good way to put it. So anyway, those were some of my thoughts.
Thanks. Anybody want to jump in? In fact, if I can, I'll jump in with member of our group, Daniel, has texted some of his thoughts in our back chat room, but isn't able to be here today. I don't want to put any words into his mouth, but I do want to just read exactly kind of what he essentially said that the talk reminded him of the phrase by President Oaks that, and I'm trying to scroll to it to get it correct, but I've scrolled all the way to the top of our chat from years ago, and now I'm scrolling all the way to the bottom again. So give me just a second. Here we are. Okay, that Elder Oaks is quoted as saying that it's wrong to criticize leaders of the church, even if the criticism is true, and that he said that's Brother Corbitt's talk in a nutshell. And my response to that was, except that he gave reasoning in this talk behind why he says it's wrong to criticize leaders of the church. And Daniel's response to that is, well, quote, the Lord calls upon his covenant children to sustain other general and local church leaders called under the direction of the First Presidency and the 12. Thus, any activism or advocacy that could weaken one's own or another's confidence, faith, or prayer in or on behalf of church leaders, or diminish one's ability to give heed to the words of the prophets and apostles, is obviously not of God. And this is he's quoting Brother Corbitt here. In my observation, such lack of faith inevitably leads to letting go of the church entirely and losing the testimony of Jesus. Hence, ATC often indirectly undermines faith in Jesus Christ, unquote. And then Daniel says, so in other words, it's wrong to criticize leaders of the church, even if the criticism is true, because it will damage people's faith in the church. The reason, and then he says, the reason is woefully unconvincing to me. And later he says, he quotes Martin Luther King Jr. saying, for years now, I've heard the word wait. It rings in the ear of every Negro with a piercing familiarity. This wait has almost always meant never. And then he's saying that in response to me, basically, because I'm saying that criticizing leaders of the church takes your focus and the focus of others off of the doctrine of Christ and of faith in Jesus Christ. And I want to comment on this real quick, because I guess I put Daniel's response ahead of what I was going to say here, because when I listened to Brother Corbitt's talk, I went ahead and listened as if it was directed at me. I'm in my own mind a little bit of an activist. I want things to change where I feel that they should change in the church, and that's why I'm here talking. But I have at the same time my own faith and testimony in the restored gospel, and have experiences with the Lord, personal as well as experiences from family members that have strengthened and my own testimony and witness. And so as I'm listening to him, I'm hearing him say that attacking or criticizing church leaders has the tendency to take the focus off of faith in Jesus Christ and off of the doctrine of the restored gospel and Jesus Christ. And that's where our focus should be as we put our focus in the doctrine of Jesus Christ, as we put our faith in Jesus Christ, then things change for the better. And as we take our focus off of those things, then we lose our testimony, we lose our salvation, things don't get better. And so essentially, focusing on activism is the wrong tool, and criticizing leaders of the church is the wrong tool in this case, because of the way that it takes our faith off of Christ. And I heard that, and it to be honest, it did touch me. It cut me. It made me feel like, okay, I can see that to me, the most important thing for myself, for my children, for my friends and family around me, is I do want them to come unto Christ, to have faith in Christ. And so to the extent that my activism might take the focus off of Christ and faith in Christ, I do want to be careful. I heard that message and I appreciated that from Brother Corbitt. And so when I presented that to Daniel in our backroom chat, and I said, okay, so this is how I would have summarized the talk. Not just criticism is wrong, but criticism takes the focus off of Christ. And that can be hurtful on an internal perspective, so therefore, when we do put our faith and focus on Christ, then things change for the better. And then he responded with the Martin Luther King Jr. quote saying that that just sounds like, wait, and things will get better. Let's do this. And, and as Martin Luther King Jr. said, but wait often means never. And so activism is a good thing. And I got to admit, I like Daniel's responses, and some part of me is torn on all this. So there's, I feel Brother Corbitt's intensity, his desire to make sure that we cling to and focus on the gospel and Jesus. And I also understand, as Daniel said later in the chat, that his problem is that changes do come about in the church through activism. And so if we don't have that activism, then some of those changes won't happen.
Can I ask you a question?
Please.
So I feel like the spirit of where a lot of activism comes from is probably that they feel like they are living the principles of Jesus Christ. So how do you balance that?
And absolutely, and I appreciate the question, because that's certainly the focus of my personal activism. I would feel like if I'm being an activist or trying to make things better, it's because I do have faith in Jesus Christ. I do have, a testimony of the restored gospel, and I want my children to have that same faith and that same testimony. And I feel like there are ways that perhaps the church, maybe some leaders who are human, have taken their focus perhaps off of where they should be. And so absolutely my own personal activism, and I believe absolutely people who want to do, how do you say it right, who agitate, activate, who pushed for
bring
change,
attention to, right,
who bring attention to problems,
yeah,
for the most part, when they start down that path, they're doing it with love for the gospel and a desire, of course, to make things better. And in response to your question, I think people start on the right path, and Brother Corbitt, I think, acknowledges that. But he then says, this is the wrong tool, though, for what you're trying to do. The tool is to stay focused on Christ and faith. And I guess what struck me today in church, in sacrament meeting, was that a priest in our ward gave the prayer, and he has a really hard time. He stumbled through some of the words of the prayer, and by the time he was done, having backtracked and said 2 or 3 things this way and that way and whatever, I thought in my mind for sure he had misread the sacramental prayer. And to me, I was like, he should do it again. But the stake president was on the stand, and he did not call for a reprayer, and it just went. And I sat there for just a second, just long enough to go, well, it's not my responsibility. I've got no part in making this decision about whether or not this was done correctly. And that was this momentary thought and lesson of, the the keys are with a particular person. He's sitting on the stand, the keys to fix this or whatever. And the fact is, for me to get up and argue or say anything or do anything or to agitate that this was done wrong, this needs to be better, could only make the situation worse in that moment. Because the truth, and this is just an example, but the truth is that it's the contention, the fighting, and that kind of ruins the spirit, the process, and what we're trying to accomplish. And I think that for the most part, if I stay focused on, if I had done any agitation, any active work in that moment would have disrupted the focus on the Savior in the middle of the sacrament. It just seemed like an interesting analogy to what we were going to talk about today. And since the church leader was there, that's his responsibility. It's not mine. And we just get to focus on the Savior. Anyway, who wants to chime in there?
You can't. Well, I just have a really short thing I want to share. You guys can talk the rest of the time. I just found an interesting response on one of these forums I was looking at in preparation for this. So, and it really struck me into like kind of at least what I hope that Brother Corbitt was like the core of his message is more along the lines of activism. Is not saying activism is bad in general, because activists on behalf of the church, obviously we should be that activists for Christ, and not even that. Like if you have a problem with the church or something that they're doing, he's not saying, just shut up and ignore it. The leaders are perfect. He acknowledges that they're not. Am I cutting off a little bit? Okay. But
Great.
Okay. One of the points, and we can read through these later if you guys want, but he says like, here's some criteria for assessing whether your cause is just in the eyes of the Lord or whatever. But the one I want to focus in on is, it says, does it seem more geared to advancing a narrative rather than the cause of Christ? And so this person on this forum put some really interesting insights. They said, here, let's compare two ways of doing the same thing and see which one sounds more like a narrative and which one sounds more like the cause of Christ. So first one says, okay, you see advancing a narrative more when, let's say, someone comes out as homosexual or something in a testimony meeting and it's planned and they've invited all their friends and they have it live streaming on social media and they're trying to do it to get attention so that they can get a name for themselves and shed negative light. I mean, maybe this one's not negative light per se on the church, but he's like, compare that to, let's say, someone maybe in a Sunday school class or like a ward Facebook group chiming in and saying, hey, I don't know whether they come out in this situation or not, but like explaining why the Gospels has certain principles that are difficult for them because of either their support for homosexual, people or themselves and their feelings. And so there's ways to say, hey, this is why I feel that way. And that's just one example. He says, let's say you see it when they organize a global women wear pants to church day and they organize it across the world and they're like advocating and like, there's nothing wrong with wearing pants in church per se, but if you're doing it to protest and be like, and you're doing it to like, say, in your face church, as opposed to a young woman's leader choosing to wear pants to church to help some young women feel more comfortable about the way they dress. Okay, and then the last one says, you see more narrative focus when there's a group of former members, they get together and sue the church over things like tithing and then go to the media and talk about unchristlike behavior, where he's saying, let's say, launching or joining legal action against a church member because there's been, actual abuse or money laundering or something, and not having to necessarily, I mean, I may disagree here. Like you might want to call the media about some of that, but, or even a faithful member opposing a sustaining a member, even in general conference, if they have knowledge about why that person shouldn't be in leadership, meaning like, hey, this person like abused me when I was 12. I object. I need to go talk to you. I mean, that's a weird example, as opposed to just like, boo, church, because they're just actually business leaders and not men of God. Boo, we hate. So the whole strain of thought here is just the motive and the method of your activism seems to be what Brother Corbitt is getting at, as to how you can weigh whether or not it's actually something good. So I think all the stuff that you've talked about, Steve, about like your activism, and I have, like, I'm not like activist, but like I speak up in Sunday school and try to like complicate the conversation a little bit. And I think doing that is more in line with, something good, as opposed to, I'm not like filming it and be like, look at me defy the church and like ex-Mormon Reddit, come make me feel good about myself. That's my 2 cents.
Can I just quickly respond to it was a thread that Stephen said, and then Corey kind of had a juxtapose to that. So Stephen, you were saying that the contention isn't purpose. Maybe it's not the purpose in that moment in sacrament meeting, but I really do like how Corey was saying, like, he's willing to be contentious a little bit in lessons, maybe, because I actually, I don't think that individuals are very good at coming to truth. And I think that we do have to kind of push back on each other to kind of weed out the bad ideas, if you will. And so I think sometimes the church can kind of cultivate this thing of like contention, bad, evil of Satan, and actually healthy disagreement is not a bad thing. I think that's actually a really good thing. But anyway, that's just a thought I had.
Yeah, and if I can just respond to that, I agree with you in what you just said, and I think that the contention. Sorry, the contention specifically that I find to be perhaps what Christ was talking about when he says contention is not of me. It was in specific relationship to, why are you guys fighting about how to baptize? Why are you fighting about how to take the sacrament? Or, why are you fighting about how to operate and run the church? I've given certain people the keys, and so that there's no contention in this area or sphere. I think that healthy discussion, especially as you say in gospel doctrine, when we're trying to come to truth, when we're trying to I think that, like you say, that is fair game and a good place for it. When it comes down to leadership, ordinances, how things are run, it's different. There's an order, and that's to prevent the contention that splits the people from being one, that divides them into this group and us versus them. So, Jake.
Yeah, I wanted to bring up, because Daniel makes an allegation in the chat that you were having that we haven't really addressed head on. And I think we should examine maybe some things in the past that could have been activism towards the church, and whether it would have happened if that type of activism wasn't there, right? Because you said his problem with the thinking, right, is it's because of activism the church changes. But then he goes and says it's then that the church wants to take credit for making the said changes, and it pretends like it was their idea all along, and that they would have made the same decision without any urging from the membership, or not even from just membership, let's say other outside sources.
Or surveys.
Yeah, surveys or something like that. Well, one of the biggest things that comes to my mind is the priesthood restriction, right? Blacks in the priesthood. Black members of the church couldn't have the priesthood before 1978. There was a lot of backlash during the civil rights movement, right, which was in the 60s. And so we're pushing at least 10, almost getting closer to 20 years later before any action is taken by the church. There were planned boycotts against the BYU football team and all sorts of things that were pushing back both inside and outside the church. So I guess, are we saying, but this is, I think, the perfect instance for Daniel saying, look, all of this was happening, and it took almost 20 years of this, and then the church finally acquiesced and says, okay, we're going to do it. But that's not what they said. They came out and said, well, we received a revelation, and now it's finally time, and hurrah, everyone's so happy. My guess is that he would allege that this doesn't happen without the activism. And
that's the same with the more recent switching on the
the LGBT policy, right, with baptizing children. Right? Does the backlash from there? And we could even go a little bit further and say, because Corey could come and say, well, maybe the right kind of activism, we still could have got the job done. So the question is, if we didn't have the more extreme type of activism aimed directly at the church, making the church look bad, things like that, do we think we still get these type of changes? And if we do, how do we go about approaching this type of activism so we can have these kind of changes take place, so that there's enough of a hubbub that people they get the desire to do things, right? Because we could even allege, right, there's probably all of this on the mind is what caused Spencer W. Kimball in 1978 to he even in his own memoir says that he had to do a lot more of humbling himself and coming to this realization than getting a revelation from God that this is what needs to happen. Right, or on LGBTQ, the 2015, the November 2015 policy, that one, it was said almost like we had a talk, right, that almost raised it to a revelation, and then it was just kind of hush hush. I was like, no, it was just a policy that was pushed away. So curious on your thoughts.
Yeah, so obviously I struggle a lot with the Corbitt's talk is definitely pushing toward like obedience to authority, and that would be great if there were a living prophet that spoke for God. But there's a lot of people that don't believe that, and even within the church, I think there's a lot of people wrestling with that, and just they've recognized that maybe they're not talking to Jesus, right? Like it's not as clear as maybe they once thought it was. And so when if you're in that state of belief, or if you're looking at it from the outside, it doesn't look good. So that part, I don't know, like I understand that spirit of being one, and just how you can have a lot of I don't know, it can be good if you are of one mind, but I guess is that someone that takes on activism would say that there are people on the fringes that aren't fitting into that one, and if they don't say something, nobody's going to know about it, and so they feel strongly that those margins, if you will, need to be spoken for. But anyways, that are some thoughts that I had.
What's coming to my mind is something, an idea that I got from Rough Stone Rolling, the Joseph Smith biography. Remind me who wrote that again. It's
Richard Bushman.
Thank you, Richard Bushman. And I don't know that I'm going to say it the way that he intended for it to be understood, but it's kind of what I gathered. It was a period of time where, Joseph Smith received revelations. He was talking to God, and he would put these revelations into the new Book of Commandments, or as the people around him wanted them written down so they could read them, and they made the Book of Commandments, and these revelations were very important to them, and most of them in the beginning came through Joseph Smith. And then again, what I gathered from this biography, Joseph started having, meetings of the High Council and the Quorum of the 12 and the First Presidency and those things, and where he was essentially just kind of another member. He was the presiding authority at those meetings, but he was a member of a council, and the council would work together, discuss an issue. Obviously, we know that there's debate, even contention sometimes among those who are leading. We know that there has been in the past, contention in the Quorum of the 12, not just in the modern era, but in the original Quorum of the 12 that Jesus called. I mean, contention isn't like completely non-existent in leadership, and these people debate and they discuss things. And Joseph was on, at these councils, and they would make a decision and they would vote. And if there was a unanimous decision, then Joseph would have it written down and place it with his revelations in the Book of Commandments, just the same as if he had received a revelation himself and Jesus had spoken to him. And then, of course, we get the revelations that talk about how when the First Presidency does act unanimously, or the Quorum of the 12 acts unanimously, that this is doctrine and revelation and that kind of thing. And again, what I'm getting at is that it taught me something, reading that book, about the nature of revelation and guidance, and just so that I realized, Marty, as you've questioned whether there's always a prophet speaking to God and actually getting some kind of day-to-day communication with Jesus or something like that, that right there made me understand and realize that the church has been set up so that actually isn't necessary. That God can appear and give direct revelation from time to time when he deems it necessary, when he wants to do that. But generally, he's established and set up a church and a kingdom with a First Presidency that has certain keys, with a quorum of the 12 that has certain keys, with a presidency of your stake that has certain keys, a bishopric, certain keys, and then even down to the family level with husbands and wives who have keys and responsibility over their own family, and that revelation, it is not meat that I command in all things, but men should be anxiously engaged in a good cause and do many things of their own free will and choice. And so on a day-to-day basis, I don't need to have God telling me what to do every day in my life and to get revelation that way. Instead, I can make my own decisions. And for my family, my wife and I can make decisions. And when we're unanimous and we're united, we can essentially move forward as if that is the revelation, as if that is the cause that God would have us espouse, and the movement that God would have us take, that I can confidently move forward in my own decisions in my own personal life, as if I'm being guided by God, by revelation, even though God hasn't appeared to me and told me to do that, but so essentially more like as long as he's not stopping me type thing. Now, I know there are some dangers and some questions on this, but I have tried to, ever since reading that, apply this more and more in my own life to realize that I can have more faith that I'm aligned with God's will, as long as I'm just kind of checking in and saying, hey, stop me if I'm wrong. I really feel like this is the right thing. I've thought it out in my own mind. I believe that I'm making the right decision. Stop me if I'm wrong. Okay, that's my personal revelation. I can do that with my wife, and in whatever calling I'm in, and for my family, and in whatever calling I'm in, if I happen to be serving in an elders quorum presidency, a bishopric, a stake presidency, I can do that with my counselors or whatever. We can think it out, reason it out, make decisions, vote. And if we're unanimous, this lesson is that then that is the will of God for us at this moment, even if it's not a direct revelation or what he would tell us to do if he were standing right there. It's more like, sure, okay, go ahead, try that. That'll work too. We'll see how that goes. And we'll all learn from it, and all of humanity or all of whatever. Okay. So all I'm getting at is that I don't have to believe that President Nelson is talking to God day to day to believe that he is moving forward with his counselors and with the quorum of the 12 in a manner that is pleasing to God, and in a manner that Joseph would call revelation or guidance, because they have the keys, because they're trying to do what's right. And so they may make mistakes, and they do make mistakes. And it's not my position to correct them, but at the same time, I can, as we've talked about in my calling, in gospel doctrine, and even in videos like this, I can try my very best to continually sound the trumpet of Jesus Christ lives. He loves you. He loves me. He loves us. He loves his LGBTQ brothers and sisters, children, who whatever direction we're, whether Jesus is brother or father. And he loves all of us as we are. And I can say that, believe it, teach it, even if I think that a particular doctrine or, policy recently or whatever is not echoing that very well, Anyway, those are some thoughts. Who wants to chime in next?
You're muted, Marty.
Had some children making funny noises. So I guess if I had a couple of ideas as you were saying that. I also read Rough Stone Rolling as I was just kind of in all the turmoil, right when everything collapsed. And I had this realization, and I don't know if it was some sympathy, I guess, for anybody trying to organize a religion. And so Joseph Smith taught about personal revelation, and then everybody was receiving personal revelation for the church. And so then he solved that by saying, well, only I can receive personal revelation, right? And I have sympathy toward any organization who, I think, I don't believe, obviously, that the church is Christ's church. So I see it as an organization. And I have sympathy toward an organization trying to stay together and unified when it's made up of lots of different people, lots of different opinions. So I guess I have some sympathy with organization and like how they try to do that. I guess where it bothers me a little bit is that there are people that believe that God is guiding the church in a special way over different organizations, right? So they actually have a belief that it's not just any organization, it's Christ's church. And so then maybe they won't trust their own connection with the divine, if you will. I don't know what I think about intuition. But I think intuition is a good way for us to help us know how to act, but I don't think it's a good way for us to know like objective truth, if that makes sense. So if someone's intuition is telling them, for example, if you were gay, that you should try to find someone you can be with that can help correct you and have a unit of a person to have that same thing that any other couple has, like they're going to have a hard time because they might not allow themselves to go there because they believe that God said no, even though their intuition is telling them that maybe this is like I don't if you guys follow politics at all, but follow a Dave Rubin path, right? And that's where I struggle, I guess, a little bit, is that there's like a supernatural, there's a belief there. And so it's almost like, this is where we kind of talked about this before, about transparency, about what they know and how they know it. Like you can believe they have keys, but I have sympathy for trying to keep an organization together, but I also see a lot of problems with it that come with some baggage, since I'm not a believer and I'm looking at it and I know that a lot of people do believe that, if that makes sense. So those are some of the thoughts I had.
Daniel's joining us. This is exciting. Oh, look. Yes, we love it. We have finally been joined by the voice of Daniel. We've been trying to state some of your position. Have you been following it? I'm not hearing you.
Oh yeah, I was muted. Can you guys hear me? Yeah, I was listening. I missed the first like 15 minutes, I think. But I heard Jacob speak up for me, so
That's mostly where we ragged on you, and then he defended you.
okay. You guys can continue with the last point. I'll jump in where I can.
We've kind of knocked it around. We've just you were saying that your voice isn't doing so well. We won't comment on whether or not that's some kind of a message. But go ahead and share your thoughts on this matter.
Maybe you guys have addressed it. Tell me if you have. But
well, here's what we did. If you missed it, I read through the texts that you messaged to me, and then I just kind of responded to them without you being around, because I didn't want you to have the ability to defend yourself while I was.
Well, I'll say something that I don't think I said in the group chat, but I've had a chance to go back through and listen to Corbitt's talk again the other day. There was another part that stood out, is there's parts where he's like kind of praising some of the political activism that's happened in the history of like the United States, specifically civil rights movement. And it frustrated me that he wants to use the civil rights as an example of good activism and kind of gloss over the fact that the church opposed aspects of that. I think of Ezra Taft Benson and some of the things he had to say about Martin Luther King and communism, and some pretty derogatory things. And not that Ezra Taft Benson is the church, but he was the prophet at the time that he said some of those things, or an apostle when he said some of those things.
I was going to say, Ezra Taft Benson was in the 80s. So.
And I think of, and he was an apostle when he was saying some derogatory things about the movement, about Martin Luther King,
sure,
and became a prophet later. And then I think of like the Equal Rights Amendment that the church opposed and helped to get defeated in Utah, which prevented it from passing. And so there's instances where the church has kind of fought against some of that too. So it's interesting to hear Corbitt kind of talking about how activism can be a good thing, and kind of use examples that the church has even fought against at some point in its past.
That's a good point. I appreciate that. I can understand how that, yeah.
I can imagine a future 20, 30 years from now where the church will allow gay members of the church to be married and be in good standing. And I can see them whitewash the history and try to gloss over the fact that they fought it for as long as they did. So it's like they can say activism is bad, you shouldn't do this. Certain members will disagree with it. And then later on, they'll pretend like it was always on the agenda that this would be allowed one day, just like they did with blacks in the priesthood.
Yeah, and I'm supposed to be on the believing side, and I think this is something that if you want to bring other things in this comment, another accusation that's leveled against the church a lot is that it seems like society at large is always 10 or 20 years ahead of the church, and then the church ends up playing catch up. And then, like you were describing, Daniel, it appears that then they try and cover their tracks and be like, well, this is what we always did. So I guess, right, on us as believers, can we point to anything where we're like, this is either where we were ahead of the curve, or this is something that we got to it in a way that didn't require outside pressure, political or otherwise?
I would say, at least, again, I've been reading about some forums, just seeing some reactions to this talk, and I'm not sure I 100% agree with this, but a lot of the people are saying, well, here's the thing, like, if anything, it should show, like, let's say blacks in the priesthood, it should show that activism isn't something that's actually effective at making a change in the church, because they didn't cave to when the main wave of strong activism in like the 60s and 70s was there. They were way late to the game till 1978, right? So, and according to some quote this guy's trying to say, he's like, President Kimball had this quote saying like, I depending on whatever the answer was, if the Lord had told me no at that point, I would have gone to my grave fighting for that point of view, saying no, that position is not going to change right now because the Lord said so. He's like, so at least obviously if you don't believe that he's guided by the Lord, that's a bunch of crap, or you're not going to believe that. But if how I deal with it as someone that does believe that the prophets do have, they are entitled to revelation for the entire church, I hear that and I think, okay, I mean, I hope that's the case, that the prophet is saying, I'm not going to bend to the whims of society. I will follow what God reveals to me. And obviously I'm not so naive to believe that they're not influenced, or the questions that they ask the Lord aren't somewhat, what's going on in the day right now. Like, for example, I'm sure, there obviously is a lot of talks right now that like talk about homosexual involvement in the church and like where to place them in the church, because that's something that the church is deciding right now, because society as a movement has really, made a big change there in the last 10-15 years. Like, you even think about like Barack Obama, for example, he started out being against gay marriage, and even just since then, when he was 2008, so from 2008 to now, society has massively shifted on that position. And so now the church is, you can say they're maybe playing catch up, but they're reevaluating because there are societal pressures. And so I would hope that the leaders are praying, trying to get revelation on this, because I see many issues with, it's not that hard for me to be like, you're right, there's kind of a problem there. Where do these kind of people fit in this plan of salvation? It doesn't seem that that you left room for them there. And so, gosh, that doesn't seem like the God I believe in, because he's, made a place for everybody. And so I sure hope that they're asking the Lord for some more revelation on that as a believer from that perspective. But as if you don't believe that they're guided, obviously, I mean, I have a cynical view too, and I can look at that and be like, exactly what Jake was kind of describing. Like, the other view is like, yeah, they have to cave eventually because society shifts, and then they just get so old fashioned that like no one will belong to their church if they don't shift their views, and so they shift it. And then I will, I will say there's a lot of good stuff, Ezra Taft Benson said, but I will say, like, I'm embarrassed every time I read about some of his very extreme political views as a member of the church, being like, holy crap, dude, like, how could you not see yourself, like your politics was guiding your, religion more than the other way around at a certain point. So, there's two sides to all that.
In a response to Jacob, what you were saying a minute ago about, is there an example of where the church was ahead of the curve? I think it's a hard question to come up with an answer, not because there's not such things, but because if you found such a thing, a lot of the times it looks like the craziness of the church, because the church is saying something, advocating some position that society's not on board with. And of course, they have all kinds of positions like that society is not on board with. And then that sometime at some point later, that society came around to agreeing with the church. And that's going to be, by almost definition, a challenging thing to find an example of, because a lot of times the church may be teaching one doctrine or preaching one way or saying this is what the Lord wants. And how often does the whole world eventually come around to that position? But certain things, one example, well, I don't know that I want to even bring up some of the tightest examples, but obviously the church has from time to time, the word of wisdom is one, okay, where the church came out at a point, and yes, there were other people back in those days also saying, hey, we think smoking is probably not the greatest thing. We think alcohol is probably not the greatest thing. But the church came pretty, the word of Joseph came out with the word of wisdom, and not getting into all the details about how we've kind of tweaked it differently over the years, but there are clearly some areas where tobacco and alcohol are concerned that that the rest of the world later came around to. But again, it's hard to find good examples of what you've asked for that reason. As far as, okay, pressure, I want to point out that there are examples in the scriptures of leaders of God's church caving to the pressure and the will of the people. And the examples that come to my mind right off the top of my head include Aaron, the brother of Moses, who was the high priest, the leader of Israel at the foot of Mount Sinai, when Moses was up literally talking to God. And the people said, he's been gone a long time. Aaron, why don't you just make us a god? And they pressured him. They actively, pushed for for Aaron to make them a golden calf, make them a god that they could worship. And so he did. And it was the worst possible thing that they could do in that moment. It just kind of destroyed everything from the perspective of, Moses comes down, he smashes the tablets, and God's upset. He wants to just destroy all of the children of Israel, but here we have where a leader listened to the people, did what they wanted, and interestingly, that leader remained the leader going forward. And then we have a similar example in Samuel, where the people said, Samuel, give us a king. We want a king like all the other people. And Samuel caves to this pressure from the active voices of the people, the children of Israel. And he says, it's not going to be good. It's not going to be what you want. It's going to cause all kinds of problems. And then he goes out and he chooses Saul and anoints him. And from the get-go, king after king, it's just a disaster. And in fact, that's all we have in the Old Testament, is just story after story about how the people's choice to have a king destroyed everything. And all I guess I'm saying is that it's not unheard of for the leaders of the church to cave to the pressures of the people, and they remain in power, and God lets the people do it. And it's usually not a good thing. I believe that a lot of the things that tend to be that the activists towards the church are pushing, I'm kind of in support. I've said that in this video. And at the same time, these examples flash through my mind as I think of Brother Corbitt's talk. And again, I think, taking Brother Corbitt's talk into perspective, taking these examples into perspective, I feel like I want my position going forward to be, I know Jesus lives and he loves us, and we are to love one another, to just love one another, all others, and to invite others to have faith in him and his atonement. and that's kind of where I want to rehash my position, while I'm also, if in the moment there's a discussion about homosexual activity and membership and good standing in the church, I'm going to stand up and say, hey, we're supposed to love each other. We're supposed to, love Jesus. And that's going to kind of be my position. While not, I'm going to say that, I'm going to be an activist in that way, while not necessarily, again, pointing at the leaders and saying, you're doing this wrong. Oh, and by the way, you should have called out that other person for not loving. You should have called out that person for reading the sacramental prayer wrong or whatever. That's just not my place. So I'll let that be the last I want to say, and I'll let each of you guys kind of chime in on what you want to say to sum up, and we'll wrap this up. Go ahead, Jake.
Good. I won't take super long, but I think you're onto something with looking back to the scriptures. I'm not sure where the expectation is coming. It's kind of built as the church, the modern church has grown, where we put leaders more and more on a pedestal. But when you look back in the scriptures and in the Bible in particular, and you have some of the Book of Mormon as well, but leaders, people that were called of God, were not morally superior. They weren't people that were ahead of the time saying, hey, this is what we need to do that's going to make us more righteous people. It's more of, we're a chosen people, and it's not, we're going to make life easier for ourselves and everyone else because we're chosen. In fact, oftentimes following the path makes life a lot harder. Oftentimes leaders doing stupid things is at the head of that. And so, you think of Moses when he does things wrong. You've got David and Solomon both. And it even gives an example of people that even at one time were considered morally superior in some extent, right? They were super righteous, but then how they fall, yet they're still the leaders and they're still called. And people aren't supposed to rebel against them just because they make mistakes. I think mistakes from leaders, from everyone, are baked into it. And it's not so much of this person did something wrong, and so we're all on the wrong path. It's how are we now going to react to this and continue to learn and grow and love together. It doesn't seem like God calls leaders to make life easier for people. In fact, a lot of times it's an affliction. And
that doesn't help those who don't want to follow him, though.
Yeah, it certainly doesn't, right? And that's why it's got to be a thing where I'm looking to follow God, and God has asked me to do this. And that's why I have faith and I continue in what I do. While at the same time, right, I can have these things that I push forward towards, but I shouldn't expect an institution like the church, even if it is the kingdom of God on the earth, to be with the now what's considered morally superior ahead of that. Because look back in the Old Testament times, what would morally superior be ahead then? Could we have a kind of law that we live in now, and the kind of acceptance that we expect now, with the kind of respect going on back then? What would have happened? Nothing would have ever taken hold, and you don't have a people anymore. Anyway, kind of rounding that point, but I think I guess my main point is I think we're missing the point. I asked that question, but I think that question misses the mark on what you should expect. Looking back in the scriptures and the revealed record, we have time and again showing that's not what you should expect at all. You should expect something completely different. And the scriptures tell us what that is.
Thank you. Who's up?
Can I ask a question as part of my closing?
Of course. If we go on farther, we'll blame it on you.
Mainly posed to the faithful side. Was it wrong to deny Black people the priesthood and temple ordinances in 1977?
It was
Good question. So
Is it immoral?
Ask for clarification. Yes. So what do you mean by wrong? Was it immoral?
Yeah, immoral. Sure.
I guess I'll take a stab at answering it. In what case is it immoral? Because a person has transgressed in a way that the church says is a transgression, to deny them of certain priesthood blessings as well. Is there something that being born that someone is entitled to this at a certain time and age, or at all ages?
I don't know. I mean, I don't want to get into a discussion of what constitutes moral and immoral, because that's a whole other.
Well, that's the question
but,
you're asking us
yeah.
to answer, though.
Yeah. Well,
what
I'm saying,
you know what that is.
I guess what I'm asking is, I'm asking you guys to answer in accordance with your own views on morality and immorality. I have my own definition, and spoiler alert, I think it was wrong according to my view of morality.
I can venture an answer based on the worldview and setup that I've made in my mind about these people who are the leaders of our church, considering everything that we've already said here about examples of, scriptural leaders gone wrong, I guess you could say, knowing that is still likely to happen or can happen today, and that's, as Jake was saying, is part of the journey. It's kind of baked in. To me, prophets are those who testify of Christ, who have a testimony, who've received revelation that Jesus Christ is the Son of God. To me, revelators and seers have special tools, special opportunities to testify of the future, or witness things of the future, or receive those kinds of revelations. And to me, the one that makes these brethren the leaders of the church is that they hold priesthood keys, that they're in the presidencies of the high priesthood, and that gives them the right to decide what will be preached behind the pulpit and how the church will be led. And so in my mind, I kind of break up each of their roles into distinct positions. And so, in answer to your question, that a prophet's, in my understanding and reading of the scripture, a prophet's responsibility then is also to lead souls to Christ, to point them to him. And a prophet who, for instance, points people to themselves as the example is failing in that responsibility. But I am not the one with the keys to stand up and point at a prophet and say, you're failing. Like, that's not my responsibility. And in fact, I would be failing at my responsibility should I do that. And that's a weird thing, because surely if I know a prophet is leading people astray and is off track and is whatever, then I should say something, right? But it seems like it's more my duty to point people to Christ than to get up and say, he's not pointing people to Christ. Because that's just not my responsibility or my calling. Is it right? Is it morally right to deny people the priesthood, Black people the priesthood in 1977? For me, I'm not in that position, right? So from just looking from my perspective, I had no power. I wasn't even alive then, but if I had been, I wouldn't have had the keys or the ability to do anything but to say, Jesus loves all his children, and let's focus on Christ and whatever. I would have no moral obligation to get up and point at an apostle or prophet and say, you're doing this wrong. That's not my responsibility. Now, if I were a prophet or an apostle, someone who held the keys, and I were not actively trying with all my heart, might, mind, and strength to seek the will of God and to do his will in that position, I would be failing in my moral responsibility. And if I were actively trying to seek his will and do his will, and if I were under the impression that God had at one point revealed something to be this way, and I did not have the authority to change it without his direct revelation to me, how could it be morally wrong for me to hold that position? The morals are absolutely fuzzy, and they're going to depend on the person and what they're calling and what their keys are and how they understood the situation and what they were trying to do. And if those brethren were actively trying to seek the will of God, understand it, and apply it, I don't think you can hold them morally at fault. But if they were actively trying to do something hurtful to God's children, sure, you could. That would be my response to that.
Yeah, I'll say mine real quick because I know it's been a little bit since Corey said anything, but mine's very similar. I would say possibly, because there's a lot of variables. There's a variable where you have a prophet that is seeking this revelation. He's open to it, and it's not coming. Maybe it is something where there's a purpose God has for not revealing this yet. We could have an instance where he is not seeking for it. It's trying to be communicated to him, but he's not in a space where he's ready to receive it. There could be some moral responsibility there, but I wouldn't go as far as to say that he's immoral and that he's doing something wrong. It's more of he's not doing as much as he could. Now, there could be, he receives or he feels that this should be something that's happening, but out of duty or obligation to what he feels is some arbitrary law that he decides to uphold it. I think there could definitely be some moral responsibility there and say, going against everything that I feel should happen, I'm not willing to stand up and go against this. I could see there could be some immorality being chosen there.
I guess, unfortunately, we're just neither Jacob nor I or anybody here is in the position to judge what the position of those brethren.
I wasn't alive, so I don't even know what the circumstances. I can only look back at very best with a healthy dose of presentism.
Yeah, well, that's what I was saying. Like, it seems, of course, from now looking back on it, and that's, and it's hard for us to ever escape the presentism of being like, well, of course, the morality that we believe in now is the morality that's objective and eternal, and everyone from all time saw things this way, and that's how it should be. And, obviously this is a more recent history, so it's like, yeah, society itself was screaming at them like, we've moved on, we're old ideas, and we move past it. But at least from my understanding, I'm not saying that, some of the leaders didn't have racist tendencies, but listening to, I've actually listened to some podcasts from like some people that are in some of the polygamous offshoot groups that still hold that this is actual doctrine, that Black people should not have the priesthood and temple blessings. And it's interesting, they describe like, well, we're not racist, actually. Like, we have no problem with like Black people because of like the color of their skin, thinking that they're stupid or inferior or something. We just believed in this principle that God revealed that they shouldn't. We don't know exactly why, but we don't, we're trying to follow God the best we can. And, we can look back and be like, well, yeah, maybe Brigham Young knew and he was just racist. But at the same time, again, that's presentism. It's like, well, was Brigham Young actively saying, oh, I know I should love Black people equally as the white people, but I just don't. And therefore, I'm going to give in to my bigotry. Or it's hard to be like, well, obviously that was kind of the view of the day of pretty much everyone. And again, that's one of the pitfalls of religion, and especially this religion, being like, well, yes, but shouldn't he have special knowledge because he's supposed to be a prophet of God that would go over and above any of the societal, present, or his presentism versus our presentism. If it's wrong now to have those feelings, it should have been wrong then. But as and as an atheist, you probably, I don't know how you ground your morality, but like that's where it gets a little confusing, because like as LDS people, I think we also don't have the same view as a lot of other Christians of like God is the grounding of all reality, therefore moral truth is objective and forever, and there's like this thing is forever there. I think, and this is, I know other people would disagree with this, but in dialogue with Christians, let's say with like Joey, for example, I think ours is more of a relational thing of like, well, God is trying to accomplish a certain thing, and so if something is in line with that thing that we've all agreed to come down here to do right now, that is the moral thing to do. And I'm not saying the Black people in the priesthood was that thing, and maybe assuming that God wasn't screaming at them and they were just ignoring the revelation, that would be immoral. But as far as they know, they were being as moral as they possibly could. And unless they really were motivated by racist tendencies, I don't even see them as being racist, because it is really eye-opening to me, like I said, to listen to these polygamists being like, yeah, like we have no problem with Black people as like because of race. It's just this was how God wanted it to be. And that's why we're so very, very adamant about it, because we are very adamant about following God. And as an atheist, I see you could look at this and be like, wow, this is the biggest problem with your religion, is that someone a long time ago said something and you're so, well, and let me, this is the fear I've had in my mind when I've leaned into my atheist leanings of like, okay, well, let's pretend like there is no God and these leaders believe that this priesthood thing was of God. And so they're so faithful to wait to get this direct answer from God that they're not going to change it until they get this answer. But wink, wink, we know secretly there is no God. And so they're never going to get that answer until they just decide on their own terms to do it. And so, that's a possibility. But that's why the whole point of the whole message of this church, at least, and Joseph Smith's unique message wasn't like, we come to belief in God through, our creeds or like these logical proofs. It's and I know, and every ex-Mormons and everyone hates this, but like there is this stupid trump card that we like to play as Mormons of like, well, we ask people to ask for themselves and have spiritual experiences about whether or not God is in this church or not. And so I'm going off of that, saying, I know God's in here. Whether or not that means every last thing in history was exactly as God wanted, I don't know. But I have a little bit looser point of view on, and this sounds bad to say looser morality, but I mean, I don't see it as objective as in like, this particular thing is always wrong. Anyway, there's a lot that you could go against there. I know I've given quasi weak argument, but some thoughts.
Who wants to wrap up?
I just want to finish with that, where I was going with that question. As an atheist who doesn't believe the priesthood is real or that the temple ordinances afford any blessings in the next life or anything like that, I still think it was wrong to deny Black people that because they believed it was real. And if I, as an atheist, think that that's wrong, how much more wrong is it? You talked to Steve about like the role of the prophet is to point people to Christ or whatever. Denying people the priesthood and if it's all true, granting if the church's truth claims are actually real, denying people the priesthood would be doing the exact opposite, in my opinion. And how many more Black people would be members of the church today if it wasn't for that unfortunate part of our past? And so bringing this back into Ahmad Corbitt's talk, he kind of frames it as people who are committing this activism against the church are kind of doing the work of the devil. They're stirring up contentions. Whereas I see them, and at least in some instances, you could argue that they are being more Christ-like than the church. And this is an example of it. As an atheist, I think that the people who are activists against the church's position, denying Black people the priesthood, denying Black people the temple ordinances, I think the activists were the ones who were more Christ-like in that instance. And I think just saying, well, I'm going to personally point to Christ, but I'm not going to question my leaders, I don't think that goes far enough. So the way I answer it is, yeah, I think the church was morally wrong. And I think even if God is real and God was telling the prophets not to give Black people the priesthood, that it would still be wrong. I would say God was wrong in that instance, if that was truly the case. That's how I'd answer it.
Thank you. Marty, you want to try? Oh,
Yeah,
yeah.
you're trying to end it. So summary, you guys have been bringing up a lot of points. I guess my thought is that hindsight's 2020. And so we can obviously look back and say, well, we all agree now that that was wrong. And so it's really easy to like, yep, that was wrong. Current directions where people are trying to pull us, I don't know that we know that that's always like progress, right? In hindsight, we can say, oh, obviously this was the right path. But looking forward, I think it's less obvious which ideas are the ones that we want to latch onto, any kind of new idea or new, because I think some ideas are better than others. And so it's interesting because when I think about the purpose of what the best thing that I can say about religion is I think it teaches ancient wisdom. And kind of like I just finished reading Brett Weinstein's book and Heather Heying's book, and they're really making the case in that book for not tearing down like Chesterton's fence, right? Are you guys familiar with that analogy? Don't tear down a fence if you don't know what it does, right? And so I think the organizations, churches maintain things, and sometimes it's hard to update them. I think it is important to update them, but I also don't necessarily think that it's obvious. In hindsight, it's obvious, but looking forward, it's not as obvious what needs to change, I guess. If that, those are some of the thoughts I was having while you guys were talking.
I appreciate that. Thank you for that last thought there, Marty. That's a great point, that we don't always know for certain that what we're advocating for is like, especially if we don't believe that God exists, especially if we don't believe that God talks to men or to people, then our position is no better or worse than the position that the other people around us have, including those who claim to be prophets, seers, and revelators. And we don't know if we're advocating for the best position for all of the church. It's easy to be that armchair quarterback, and we don't have the same perspective. Obviously, when we're armchair quarterbacking, we can see the field differently. And a lot of times we can see it better than the quarterback who's on the field. It's the reverse, I suppose, perhaps, of someone who's leading and guiding a massive worldwide, 16 million member church, who has a different perspective and a different responsibility and a different weight on their shoulders than we do. And so again, we don't know right now if the position we're advocating for. So I guess I'm going to tie in some, to end this here, what I heard from some of you. One of the positions was that what seems to be objectionable to Brother Corbitt, and perhaps to the leaders of the church, isn't necessarily our positions, our feelings, our beliefs, what we want to advocate about, but maybe the way that we go about it. The fact is, the church changes, whether it changes because of activism or whether that doesn't affect it. The church does change only when the Quorum of the 12, the First Presidency, do come to an agreement. And so the question is, if you really think that your position is right, if you really believe you have the moral high ground over them, that they are doing something wrong, is the best way to get them to change by standing up and yelling to the world, and saying, hey, you guys are wrong. Hey, members of the church, don't listen to the prophet, he's wrong. Or, hey, leaders of the world, take a look at how the Mormons, the leaders of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, are doing this really weird thing and they should be canceled. That kind of agitation, activation, probably, if you really believe you have the moral position, doesn't seem to be the best way to get the First Presidency and the Quorum of the 12 to make a decision and make the change that will be necessary. It seems more likely that living, with a focus on Christ and faith, and then, I suppose, agitating by reaching upward carefully, slowly, to the people you're connected to the family members, the leaders around you that you know and love, having these kinds of conversations with them, and sharing thoughts and feelings. And if you happen to be connected, praying fervently on behalf of the First Presidency and the Quorum of the 12, that they will feel the presence of God, that they will receive revelation, that they will understand things, the way that I suppose you do, because you know better than them. And reaching out to them, if you have any kind of connection. I have had a couple conversations with members of the Quorum of the 12 about some of my beliefs that are slightly different. They're just they randomly pop up at, in my life. It's happened just a couple times where I've had a moment, an audience with a member of the Quorum of the 12, and I've expressed something to that person that I feel, and they were very gracious, very kind, and in fact didn't cut me down, and in fact said, I've always thought about it this other way, they said, which isn't to say it is this other way. They weren't saying. They were simply saying that, hey, I've always thought about it differently. It's interesting to hear your opinion. Anyway, I guess my point is that the activism, I would suggest that maybe thinking about the way that will actually cause hearts to soften, cause people to focus on Christ, cause people to love more, and praying for those our leaders might be the best route. Thanks though for letting me wrap up my thoughts, and we will do this again soon, I hope. I'm going to stop the video now, and if we want to hang out